Hi everyone. Today we'll be having a session on VRC-20. So primarily everything that you see around data assets or asset class, this is going to be the session on that. I'll welcome Tim on the stage. Tim, hi. Uh, Feel free to share your screen and take the session ahead.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining today. We are on week, 3 of Vana Academy. So by now, you've gone through a lot of great stuff with some of Vana's founders, with some of the other engineers on our team, with our ecosystem team. If you don't remember all the context, that's okay. There's documentation and happy to take some questions in the session as well. Today, we're going to talk about the VRC-20 token. Specifically, this is if you've been in Web3 or if you haven't, like crypto, Web3, strongly associated with tokens. For a reason, we're going to talk about specifically what a token can do for a data DAO. I'm Tim. I'm the head of protocol engineering at Open Data Labs. That's everything from our L1 blockchain to smart contracts that are part of our core protocol to like indexed subgraphs that run on top of those smart contracts and secure computing that runs on top of the L1 blockchain. So the protocol itself, you've seen the architecture, there are a lot of moving parts, and I'm kind of across a lot of that. And today we'll be talking about the tokenomics part of data DAOs. So if you see any details in this presentation, or if I bring up anything and you're like, oh, I missed that, or I want to understand more, just remember you can always go to the docs, and we are constantly updating this documentation. I think in the past week, we've added a bunch of new content. Of course, feel free to reach out in the usual support channels and whatnot, but just feel free to follow along in the docs as well. So I want to start by coming back to this core concept of a data liquidity pool. And it's important, before we understand the importance of a VRC-20 token, to understand what a data liquidity pool actually is from the perspective of the protocol itself. Basically, it comes down to an entity that's registered inside of this DLP registry on chain. So the DLP registry is a canonical record for the protocol. It's kind of the source of truth for all DLPs that exist on Vana. And all a DLP is an entity that has some name. It's an aggregation of some data set. So this could be, in this case, it's browsing data. It could be your Spotify data. It could be Instagram data or Amazon shopping data. But a data liquidity pool is generally going to be some kind of aggregation of similar data points. And from the perspective of the protocol, a DLP, in addition to having a name and some metadata like a website, also has an address for sort of the primary smart contract for that data liquidity pool. And it also has a token, which we'll come back to. And just remember that the token in the DLP is one of its most important properties. So what exactly is a VRC-20 data token? This comes back to sort of Vana's purpose and story. And in a world where, in particular, AI is changing everything, we've hit this AI data wall. AI training needs more data to continue, and that's the data wall. Typically, that data needs to be aggregated. You need a lot of it, and you need to train over an enormous amount of that. But raw data, my Spotify export, your Instagram export, that's a pretty unique and non-fungible object. So if I want to take my Spotify export and your Spotify export and put those together, they might have different values. One of them might go back 10 years. One of them might go back 6 months. So exactly how can you aggregate that data for AI training but then also do it in a fair way that properly values it and also doesn't allow fraudulent data into the system. So this is where a DLP comes in. A DLP basically creates a container around all this data and says, you can put Spotify data in here, or maybe another DLP says you can put Instagram data in here. And here's how I'm going to attach a token to that and make it fungible. And the how is facilitated by the VRC-20 token standard. Essentially, making the DLP have like a fungible property. So zooming in on VRC-20 a little bit, it basically has three core functions. And if you're familiar with tokens and crypto, some of these are familiar to you. For example, a VRC-20 token is how you incentivize data contributions. So that you can essentially think of this as a tool that you have if you want to build a particular data set, either because you want to sell access to it, or maybe you yourself want to train a model on it. You can then say, like, I need 10,000 Spotify data points. How can I go out and find that? Well, you can actually give people stake or equity in the Spotify data set that you're creating by giving them a token that represents the data contribution that they've made as an incentive. So this is basically a way to speed run collecting data and like create a market where people are willing to come to you and aggregate their data with you. That's the first core function. Another core function is that once you've aggregated all of that data, there needs to be some way for you to facilitate economic activity around it. The first, I would say, way that you might facilitate data access is in how you charge people for access, how you sell access to your data. And a VRC-20 token is a great way to do that, because essentially you could just ask people to give you some of your token in order for them to get access to some of your data. So in that way, there's a direct link between the data consumer, like the person accessing the data, and the data contributors, and it strengthens the incentive because essentially revenues or economic value is flowing from the consumer of the data that has some need for it and the individuals who contributed to it. Another way that you could facilitate data access with the VRC-20 token is through community governance. So essentially, somebody needs to set the prices for accessing data. Somebody needs to set the rules about how data can be accessed. And in a data DAO, where theoretically it could be 100% decentralized, no one person controls the data DAO, the token actually allows people to coordinate with each other by writing governance proposals and then voting on them based on how much voting power could be based on how much token a particular data DAO member controls. So the token is a way to create this like commons where people can coordinate and collectively govern the data set that they've contributed into. And now that we understand the token a little better, we can see why really without a token attached to a data liquidity pool, you really can't answer simple questions like which DLP is this data token backed by. So within the protocol, if a DLP has a token and you know that the DLP is a part of the larger system, using the protocol's data access mechanisms and using proof of contribution and all of this, then you can have a really high level of confidence that when I'm trading that token or when I'm holding that token or using it, maybe lending it out or borrowing against it, it's actually pretty representative of some real data set that has some real value in the context of AI training or some other use case. So this is like the really important link between a DLP and its economic unit, essentially, like this simple property of the token being registered into the DLP on chain. So when you want to create a data DAO, one of the first things that you need to do is create your token, because a token is essentially immutable. A token and a DLP, they get created together and they live together pretty much forever. And the token represents the monetary part of the DLP, and the DLP also aggregates the data. And so that link needs to exist pretty much from the beginning. So we've created a factory smart contract. What a factory smart contract allows you to do is you don't need to create your own data token smart contracts and then deploy them yourself and then verify them yourself and go through all of that development work. You basically just need to submit a transaction. So the link is down here, but it's also in the docs to our dApp factory. Anybody can do this pretty much right now. You could follow this link. You could find the create token function within the smart contract. You fill out all of this information and you click write and you submit a smart contract transaction, and then you have a token, which is pretty VRC-20 compliant, meaning it will work well with ADLP, and it will also fulfill a bunch of the requirements for getting ecosystem incentives from the Vana Foundation. So what exactly is this form? What are all these complicated numbers? This is all documented in the documentation. Also, if you use the Create Data DAO tool, I think Brennan showed you how to launch a data DAO using that tool in a previous session. It actually submits this transaction for you automatically on the Moksha testnet. So if you go through that flow first, you can actually see a token live on chain and maybe then look at the code that it's using to call this function and see how it calculated all of these numbers. Or you can just read the documentation and put them in manually, and that's also fine. So just to explain what we're looking at a little bit, the first field here is the type of data token. What this means, we generally recommend using type number 1. This basically just means you want to include on-chain governance. So that's using some fancy Open Zeppelin smart contracts. Basically what it is, it's a way for token holders to vote on governance proposals around your token. And you just get that out of the box if you put the number 1 here. You also want to name your token. So if I'm naming it something about Amazon shopping, maybe I use something like Amazon, probably more clever than that. The symbol is the actual trading token, like trading symbol that you want to use, generally in all caps. The owner is in the beginning when you're first launching your project, and usually you're going to have like a centralized owner who's spinning up this project. You need the address for who's allowed to, who's essentially launching this token. And that may also be the same as the beneficiary address that you use down here in this set of vesting parameters, where when you set the supply for your token, so cap is essentially like how many tokens do you want to create? In this case, it's 100 million. Just note you can type 100 million and then click the X10 to the 18 to add all the other zeros. That's just like a smart contract unit conversion thing, because smart contracts don't allow decimals, so we have to do some weird stuff with numbers. Okay, let me back up. So let's say you create 100 million tokens and you want 10% of that to go to your team. Then in order for the community to have trust that you won't rug them, for example, you won't just sell all of your tokens and cash out of the project, we've created a way for you to set up a vesting contract, like pretty much as you launch your token. So I can say, as the owner of this contract, I am also the beneficiary of the vesting for the team allocation. So this is the current time. The start is the current time in milliseconds. Cliff is like 6 months, I think. Or sorry, in seconds, not milliseconds. Cliff is 6 months in seconds. Duration is, I think, another 12 months, and the amount is 10 million out of that 100 million of tokens. By filling these vesting parameters out, it essentially creates a separate wallet smart contract, and you are allowed to, as the beneficiary, periodically go and claim tokens out of that contract according to the vesting schedule that you configure here. For the salt, you can just use 0. It doesn't, it's not super relevant. I think in the docs, we might have a little bit of an explanation of when that might come into play, but I think you're safe to just use 0. So I know that's a lot of detail and it's a lot of numbers. It's a one-time thing. So please just like take your time with it, look at the docs, make sure you understand what the different numbers are. And if you launch a token and you're like, oh, I got the supply wrong, you can just launch another one. There's nothing stopping you from shipping another smart contract. Once you deploy your smart contract, you will get an address down here at the bottom. You'll be able to also see the transaction that created it. And then you can take that address and include it into your DLP when you register your DLP on chain. And then you are pretty much good to go. So the VRC-20 standard, if you go to the VRC's documentation, and for this talk, there are really 3 VRCs that are relevant. And VRC, if you don't recall, is a Vana request for change. This is essentially a proposal that the broader set of token holders, of Vana token holders, have come to be aligned on and decided are standards for the protocol or governance policies for the protocol. The VRC-20 standard essentially sets rules about how the team launching a data DAO or DLP needs to put their allocation in a vesting contract. In general, the token supply should be fixed without significant inflation. There are also some other rules that aren't specific to the dApp factory. For example, you should have community documentation on your website that explains to your community and end users how your data token has utility. So we talked about the 3 core functions of a data token. For example, one of those is that your data tokens can be used to access data in the data set. So however data access works in your data DAO, it should be documented. Those functions should be clearly understood and implemented in order for your token to really be strongly connected to your DLP as a data-backed asset. I'll just go through the rest of these and let you know that the verified source code on the Block Explorer, what this means is that on the Block Explorer, when people look at your token, they should be able to see the source code for the token. And the Block Explorer has a way where you can upload your source code. It will double check that it matches the contract that you deployed. The factory that I just showed you, it does this automatically, so you don't normally have to worry about this. The time lock, the transfer fee cap, these are only also important if you are doing like heavy customizations to your smart contracts. For example, if you really wanted inflation and you deploy a custom token contract instead of one through this factory, then you would need to essentially give the community 48 hours before you could change inflation. That's what a time lock would be. Can you explain inflation? Yeah, really quick. Inflation could be like you start off with 100 million tokens, but your contract automatically creates, let's say, 1,000 tokens every hour. And so over time, the total number of tokens that exist inflates and grows over time. And this is pretty common in different crypto protocols or Web3 protocols where the token supply grows over time. And generally there's some like designated recipient or who receives those tokens. In our case, we think data tokens are generally going to be strongest when the supply is fixed. So that's not really a default or recommended option, but it's possible if you document it and make inflation reasonable that you can still be in compliance with VRC-20. Okay. So we have all this information about, or we have a VRC-20 token that plugs into the protocol. And really, in order for you to understand the full picture of how any VRC token contract works within the protocol, you need to understand like how it's connected to different parts of the protocol. One thing that isn't yet released, but we will soon, probably this week, be open sourcing, is a subgraph. And what a subgraph is basically, you can think of it like a special database that records a whole bunch of information from the blockchain into the database and then optimizes it to let you run certain queries on it. So over time, you're going to have data contributors putting data into your data DAO. They're going to be blockchain transactions recording all of that activity. When people access your data, there are going to be transactions recording all of that activity. And if you just wanted to go and see how many people contributed to my data DAO, but something like that can be a little bit tricky to answer if all you have is kind of the raw blockchain transaction history itself. So a subgraph is a way to take all of that information and put it into something that's easy to consume. So we will be, in our documentation, posting a link, I think it's on the VRC-20 page, to some code that you can deploy within the graph.com or within goldsky.com, which will essentially track the transactions that happen in the blockchain and then allow you to run these queries on your data. In the future, we might have some more dashboards or APIs in order for you to more easily and programmatically look up and answer questions like how many unique file contributors or data contributors do I have? And this is just an example of what one of those queries might look like. If your DLP ID is number 10, then you can simply search for the total number of file contributors and you'll get that back as an API request, for example. In order to become eligible for ecosystem rewards, all data DAOs can become eligible for ecosystem rewards from the Vana Foundation. We have a page in our docs explaining how the rewards work, how eligibility works. In order to be eligible, basically, what you need to do is you need to create a VRC-20 data token that fulfills the criteria that we've discussed so far. Part of the core functions of the VRC token is that it has utility in terms of aggregating the data and permissioning out the data for access. So VRC-15 kind of explains how the Vana protocol handles permissioning data out for access and kind of how that system works and how that flow works and how your data DAO can plug into it. So VRC-15 is kind of an explanation of how you can be compatible with the Vana protocol's data access features. And then VRC-14 is kind of the last requirement to be eligible for rewards. It's basically a requirement that you have your data token paired with the Vana token in an exchange, in the DataDex exchange, so that people can trade your token in Vana tokens. In order for you to receive rewards, you need to have some liquidity in that DEX pool. Essentially, that just means you need to have some Vana in there. You need to have some of your data token in there so that rewards can flow into that pool and sort of facilitate more trading activity on your token. So like I said, feel free to read these docs and you'll get a lot more detail and see exactly how to do this. At this point, I want to pause and essentially open it up for questions. I know we have a lot of great questions in the chat. I'm happy to just run through those, or Ayush, if you want to, you can throw some at me one by one.
Sure. Let me go through the chat. Oh, there's a question from Asha.
Sure. Could you explain what a DLP is, a mix of different data? Yeah, this is a great question. Let me go back to this view of a DLP on chain. So like a TLP, when we talk about DLP, sometimes what we're talking about is really like the data DAOs and the people that have created the DLP or the people who are contributing to the DLP. From the perspective of the protocol, this is what a DLP is, and this alone. And it's basically a definition saying there's some kind of code on the blockchain that represents like some aspects of the DLP. Sorry, that's not very clear, but basically each DLP is going to like the goal of creating a DLP is typically going to be to aggregate data of a particular type. So YKYR, for example, they're a team that has a browser extension that you can install in your Chrome or Firefox web browser. And as you are like navigating around the web, it's collecting data about the browsing activity that you're creating. And then you're able to contribute it into the YKYR DLP. So this DLP essentially is like the on-chain record for hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to take their browsing history and pool it into sort of one bucket where everybody who contributes their data, it's going to be the same kind of data. It's going to be structured in the same way once it's processed. It's going to have to follow the same rules, meaning that like I can't fake my browser activity and then submit it and expect to have a stake in this DLP because I won't earn the VRC-20 token for contributing bad data because there are actually checks in place to validate that data. So over time, as people are contributing to the DLP, the data set grows and all of the data is sort of verified to have some value and to be queryable together. So if you and I both contribute our browser history, then YKYR should be able to train a model that understands how different users browse the internet, or maybe there's a non-AI use case where they can then take that data to market. So hopefully that answers your question. And to explain fungible as relation to owning data, right? So to define fungible for anybody that's not familiar with that term, it's kind of like think of a dollar bill and how if I have a dollar bill and you have a dollar bill, we can trade those dollar bills and essentially nothing has changed. But if I have something non-fungible, let's say like an orange, if I have an orange and you have an orange and we trade those, maybe your orange is really big and mine's really small, and they actually have a different amount of value. That's probably a bad example because oranges are actually commodities which are traded as if they're fungible. But essentially it's like my car versus your car. They're not fungible. You can't just exchange them and expect them to have the same value. Making data fungible is one of the core problems that Vana solves because, like I said, if I have 10 years of listening to Spotify and I export that listening history, and let's say you have 1 month of history listening to Spotify, somebody training an AI model is going to find my listening history a lot more valuable because it's more rich, there's more information, and it can help a new AI model a lot more. So if we just put our two data points together, then if we were compensated equally, I might feel like that was unfair. You might feel like you had a huge payday and maybe there wouldn't be enough tokens to go around because people could fake some Spotify data and then throw it into the DLP and sort of get unfairly compensated. But if we can sort of properly value the contributions, and then let's say I get 10 Spotify data tokens, and you get one Spotify data token to represent that my data contribution has 10 times more monetary value than yours into the same data set, then we both get to contribute to the data set. We both get to earn revenues that the data set earns from data consumers. And so we're both happy. And now we both have a token, which I can exchange one of my Spotify data tokens for one of yours, and nothing changes because that's essentially a fungible object. So what we've accomplished by creating this token and mapping it to the data is then it can go on to trading markets. People can speculate on it and invest in it. People can lend those tokens to borrow money. Like, there are a lot of use cases that we think will sort of develop around data tokens as they relate to DeFi. But like, basically that's the core idea. Okay, I think we talked a little bit about inflation already. That's just the token supply growing over time. Is there a thought of making the data creation and token creation more user-friendly and easy for non-technical people who are user-owned data enthusiasts? What is the DataDex? Yeah, so Brennan shared a link to the DataDex in the chat. That's basically a place where you can trade data tokens for other data tokens, or you can trade Vana for data tokens. Definitely would encourage you to go check that out and see some of the data tokens that already exist. And in terms of making the creation process more user-friendly, totally hear you. Even though you can technically do this in your web browser, this is not the most user-friendly. I'll be the first to admit that. One of our team's priorities, I would say in the next 1 to 2 quarters, is investing a lot in the tooling layer. So that's how can developers more easily create data DAOs, launch tokens, access data, build data applications, create AI training jobs, all these different things. We have pretty comprehensive, I would say, like low-level technology, and we're now investing more in the developer tooling layer. And in addition to that, we are also definitely looking at, would it be possible to make a UI that you could just click some buttons on and create a token or create a data DAO that way? I think we're seeing people in the ecosystem think about these problems too. So, it doesn't have to be the Open Data Labs team. It could be actually somebody on this call could go off and build like a data DAO launchpad or a data DAO token launchpad or something like this. So we're definitely thinking about this. I think it's extremely important to lower the barrier to entry here, to onboard as much data as possible. For now, it's extremely early in this emerging data economy, and we're building all this stuff from scratch. So it's just going to take some time. But we're here to help. If you reach out in Discord, we will definitely work with you and potentially try to help you connect with some technical resources if you're non-technical, or vice versa. Mauricio, go for it.
Hello, thank you. I was just curious. I was watching the video. I'm gonna make sure to see it completely. But my background is not being developer. What we have currently been doing inside our DAO is trying to own as many nodes because we want to represent the 2% of the whole hypercycle network. So these nodes are already running and they are processing a lot of data and information, but we don't know how to capture this data. Obviously, this data is inside of the hypercycle ecosystem and protected by TOTA IP. But I'm trying to figure out how can we do this in a legal way framework where we can start giving you the data, or how can Vana team start, how do we make the connection from our hypercycle node factories that are VRC 1177 per se, or 1155, I think. How do we convert all that information where we can connect also APIs from the Node Explorer, maybe to start gathering data or looking patterns? Or how do you see this working? Or with whom can I talk to see how do we make this connection?
Sure. Just to start there, if you go into the Vana Builder Discord, and maybe Brennan or somebody can drop a link to the Discord if you're not in it, we have a technical questions channel where you can like ask this question. We'll point you to all the right resources and try to answer your questions. You mentioned the previous sessions. I definitely think looking back at the probably protocol or architecture talk in particular and the workshop for launching a data DAO would be a good place to start in terms of understanding how do you put data into the system in a way that kind of protects you from data regulations. Basically, like Vana's architecture facilitates all of this, where you're essentially empowering individual data contributors, or maybe in that case, it's nodes, to contribute their data directly into the protocol. And then you're also facilitating the process for like validating that data and turning it into something structured that can be queried, and then obviously like mapping that to the token and allowing for that data to be accessed by you or somebody else. So I would say like definitely go back and take a look at the architecture, look through our docs, and check out the Builder Discord. Great question.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tim.
For sure. Is there a risk that these tokens might be considered securities? Okay, so first of all, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what I can or should say on a recorded call. I don't think I can say definitively whether or not your token is a security. So please, do your due diligence in terms of like what Vana is sort of providing out of the box. One thing that I might say is in a decentralized DAO, like you may not even necessarily be in full control of the token. If the DAO is in control of the token, maybe you helped launch it, but you aren't necessarily like controlling the data. You aren't necessarily, I'm just gonna like maybe punt that question to our team. If you throw that question in Discord, we can connect you with maybe somebody from the legal side at the Vana Foundation. I think it's a great question, and I wish I could like get into that more. But I'm probably just not the right person to answer that question. So apologies for that. Is it possible to create derivative data DAOs? Let's see. If Vana is the root and our DLP token is a first derivative, we create second, third, and nth order DLPs. If you have just one DLP for a specific but broad purpose, DLP contributors may feel diluted. I think that's a really great question, and it's an interesting question. So for example, I've been talking about Spotify as an example data DAO, and Unwrapped is actually a real DLP, a real data DAO that is going live or has gone live, where you can contribute your Spotify data. You can imagine like a music listening DAO, where you could contribute Spotify data, or let's see, YouTube music data, or Amazon music data. And maybe all of those things get pooled and structured in a way where you can contribute any contributor's listening history, or you can see like listening history across all of these platforms. And maybe that's useful and has value, and putting a token around all of that makes some sense. Maybe to your point, like the Amazon history isn't going to be as valuable as the Spotify history. And so in some ways you dilute the Spotify data contributors by allowing Amazon music contributors to contribute into that data set. I think like I would answer this in two ways. One is your proof of contribution function really needs to do a good job of mapping the specific data point that it's checking to some kind of score or number of tokens that that data contributor should receive. So if your proof of contribution function is very effective, maybe it's doing a good job of rewarding Spotify contributors more than Amazon Music contributors, if for some reason that difference matters. But I think there's also a strategic decision there that you need to make as a data creator about like what useful data set would an AI model trainer want, or what would be most useful for you. If having like music listening history across different platforms is the thing that is the problem you want to solve for, sure, put it all in one data set and normalize those data contributions somehow. If you fundamentally want to use Spotify for a different purpose than you would use Amazon data, maybe you don't put those into one DLP. Maybe you launch those as two different DLPs with their own tokens. And I think like you could start to think about, okay, how could I then kind of put those under one governance body? Maybe you could have like a project data DAO token. Maybe you could have a separate data DAO token from your individual DLP tokens that's kind of specifically for governance, where the DLP tokens are specifically for monetizing or tokenizing the specific data sets. I think there's a lot of like creative possibilities that we haven't fully explored yet. So would love to see people in the ecosystem experiment with these things. And I think as we get more and more mature data DAOs, we're going to see people start thinking more about this. Like, what's the next data set that I can aggregate and tokenize, and how's that going to fit in to what I've started doing already? Is there someone from the Vana team that can help us convert our data? Okay, I think we just talked about this, Mauricio. Thanks for the question. Can you speak to how VRC-20 transfer value from buyer to seller? Can one set a VRC-20 to data record rate? Okay, so I think this question is basically, how do you value your data? How do you know how much of the token to give to a data contributor, for example? I believe a lot of data DAOs that have launched already, they've like published documentation or tokenomics, for example, that describes, in some cases, the first data DAO contributors, they might get more tokens. And then later on, the marginal data contributor might be worth a little bit less. So maybe they get some fewer tokens. Or maybe in the beginning, you just want to reward people with more tokens in order to like get the ball rolling and bring people in.
Actually, hey, Tim.
Hey, Josh.
I think I might be jumping ahead to data access. I'm more thinking about if you commit some data and then the buyer, person that wants to access that data for their LLP or whatever, LLM, that rate or that type of thing. And how does that all kind of work? So I might be jumping ahead.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's okay. I think it's a great question. As soon as you put your token, as soon as you launch your token and it gets listed on the data dex and it's paired with Vana, the market is going to find a price. The market is going to set a price for what it thinks your token is worth. And what that means is when you launch your token, if you set the price too low, people will buy it and the price will go up. If you set your initial price too high, people will sell it until it comes down to the equilibrium where the market thinks is a fair price. Whatever that price is, one approach you can use for data access is you can think about, if I want to charge, $10,000 for this, if I want to charge a model trainer $10,000 to access my data and train an AI model, like the full data set, how many of my tokens is roughly $10,000, and then I'm going to set that as a price for that data access, that particular data access event. Or you might not want to denominate your pricing in dollars. You might actually just want to denominate it as a, let's say, percentage of your total token supply. So maybe I'm happy to let anybody access my full data set and train an AI model if they pay like 0.5% of the total token supply, which is pretty significant, but maybe it needs to be significant because you're giving them a lot of value. So yeah, I think maybe that we'll talk about this more when we get to data access in the future. I'm not really sure what the schedule is there, but I think this is a great question. Also happy to talk more about this in Discord.
Great, thank you.
Something like a bioprotocol launchpad for Vana tokens would be great. I agree. I think like having some kind of launchpad that makes it really easy would be fantastic. And personally, like I'm optimistic and thinking of a future where actually there are just thousands, if not tens of thousands of data sets on Vana, and it's actually pretty trivial to go through this process. So you guys are really early and in kind of pioneering the process. That means it's going to be pretty tough relative to what we want to see in the future. How do we get a feel for what is valuable data? Are there any studies, or is this still very new? I think we have some resource. Maybe Ayush can share it, or maybe we can hunt it down and find it in Discord. But we have some information about what kinds of data sets will be valuable. I think actually, if you go back to the recorded sessions, Art gave a session about data sets that have value. So if you go watch that recording, it's probably going to answer your question pretty deeply. How do VRC-20 tokens stay secure or trustworthy if the person creating the data isn't a developer? Great question. So one of the things that we wanted to achieve by allowing data creators to launch tokens using our factory contract is that these contracts so basically when you submit this transaction, you are creating a new smart contract, which is your tokens contract. And we've already basically audited that contract. So if you use this factory to create your token contract, you can essentially trust that your contract is audited. You don't have to pay a security firm to audit your contracts. You're pretty much good to go. And if you want to see the specific security audit that was done on this factory and the contracts it generates, I believe there's a link to that in our documentation. Or again, you can just throw a question in Discord and we will get you that, that audit. Let's see. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions unless I missed something. Are there any other questions? Oh, is it possible to grant partial access to a data set? Yeah, definitely. So I don't know if Gitov talked about that during the architecture session. I guess in data access, the next data access session, this will probably be covered, but essentially you get to set the terms of what access is allowed and at what price. So you'll be able to decide, this data consumer is allowed to query for this data and use it in this particular secure compute job that might be training an AI model on, half of the data or half of the columns on all of the rows of the data. Basically, it's fully under your control. What are some successful examples of VRC-20 tokens being used today and what made them work? I think probably the most successful example I can give is actually a precursor to VRC-20, because before the Vana chain was actually launched, the Reddit data DAO kind of proved out the concept of a data DAO. And the Reddit data DAO, I think you can go to like rdatadao.org or something like that. I believe it had over 100,000 data contributions from Reddit users who exported their Reddit data. and contribute it, they got a token called RDAT. At the time, I believe that token was launched on Base. And I do not remember what the total, like what the peak trading volume was, but I believe it was pretty significant. Sorry, I can't cite the specific numbers, but I would say that's the most successful example or best reference I can give you. And what made it work? I think what made it work is it was really easy for people to understand that, in particular, Reddit had already been in the news for selling user data in like, I think they were getting like $60 million a year, or maybe even more than that, for selling their data. So the story was really easy for a user to understand, like, hey, I'm really active on Reddit. I've contributed a lot to this data set that Reddit is actually already monetizing. And that makes it obvious that if somebody else could monetize it, and if I have the right to contribute that data into that pool, that I could earn something. And so essentially that kind of went viral. People were getting pretty significant amounts of money, essentially, for contributing their data. And I think it really just came down to this light bulb that individuals had. Like, as data DAO creators, you guys are kind of ahead of the curve in understanding the value of this. But I think in the Reddit data DAO case, it really showed me that users can understand this if they understand the right story. And in that case, it was kind of a no-brainer for anybody who saw this, let's say, in the news and wanted to check it out. Follow-up question, as data sets are emerging, are there areas that are more lucrative? Finance versus wellness, scientific versus medical? Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, like, I couldn't tell you those as well as like Art could. I think we've seen some data from the market, like even before Vana existed. Sometimes data sales are publicized. One thing that I know is, I think from a deal that Apple did, images from Shutterstock were purchased for like almost $1 or maybe $1 to $2 per image. So if you think about different forms of content, like video is generally worth more than images, is worth more than text on a per data point basis. Yeah, I don't have a great answer to this question. I think a lot of this is still kind of to be discovered. And I would definitely look at the resources that we've sort of shared about which data sets we believe will have the most value. I think there's even like a bounty board or something with very specific data sets that we think would be great for data DAO creators to build. Okay. And we are building a credit card data DAO. Thoughts on the opportunity and feedback? I think that's really interesting. I'm sure like credit card transaction activity, if that's what you're capturing, could be very valuable in the same way that advertisers love to see shopping history from their competitors and stuff like this. I think like the opportunity probably comes down to knowing who your customer is and helping them like learn how to access the data, knowing how to market your data set to them, that kind of thing. But I think that's a great and interesting idea. Thanks for sharing. So I think we're just about at our time here. If there are any very last minute questions, I'm happy to take like one or two more. Cool, I think that'll do it then. I'll kick it back to you, Ayush. Thanks everybody so much.
Cool. Thanks, Tim, for the session. This was super helpful. Also, guys, if you have any questions, any thoughts, or anything that you want to discuss, feel free to post it on the Discord and we'll get back to you on this. That being said, thanks everyone. Thanks for joining in. See you soon. Peace.
Cheers, guys.